The view from the penthouse at Sinclair Ventures was always flawless, a glittering sea of Manhattan lights that made Sophia feel untouchable. But as Raphael handed her a glass of Merlot, the screen of her phone lit up face down on the marble counter, a single unsaved number illuminating the dark kitchen. Sometimes the loudest betrayals happen in the quietest moments, leaving behind nothing but ashes. If stories of hidden truths, quiet vengeance, and the devastating cost of secrets resonate with you, stay with me. There is so much more behind these closed doors. Don't leave just yet. The rain in Manhattan never truly washed the city clean. It only made the neon lights of the skyline bleed into the wet asphalt below. From the floor-to-ceiling windows of their Tribeca penthouse, Rafael Vasquez watched the blurry crimson taillights of the late-night traffic snaking toward the Holland Tunnel. The apartment was suffocatingly quiet, save for the rhythmic low hum of the climate control system, a $50 million silence. Behind him, the soft rustle of high-thread count silk sheets signaled that Sophia was finally asleep. Raphael didn't turn around. He held a half-empty tumbler of scotch, the ice long melted, diluting the amber liquid, just as the last decade of his life had been diluted into a series of polite, sterile routines. Sophia Rodriguez, a name that struck both respect and fear into the junior partners at Sinclair Ventures, looked almost fragile in the dim ambient light. Her dark hair was splayed across the white pillows, the very picture of a woman exhausted by the relentless, high-stakes demands of venture capital. Or so Raphael had told himself for the past 6 months. He walked over to the sprawling marble island in the kitchen, his bare feet silent against the heated hardwood. Resting next to a vase of white orchids was Sophia's phone, which it was placed face down, a habit she had developed recently. Privacy, she had called it when he playfully asked about it a few weeks ago. Corporate compliance. It was 1:14 a.m. The screen suddenly flared to life against the cold marble, casting a stark blue glow that illuminated the delicate veins in the orchid petals. The vibration was switched off, a meticulous setting for someone who didn't want to be disturbed. Or caught. Raphael didn't want to look. Every instinct of the man who had loved her since their days in cramped, humid college dorms screamed at him to walk away, to pour another drink, to preserve the fragile glass house they lived in. But the blue light pulsed again. A second notification. He stepped closer. The reflection on the polished stone allowed him to read the banner preview without even touching the device. Brock, still thinking about the hotel elevator. Leave him, Sophie. You deserve a man who actually plays the game. Brock, I'll see you at the board meeting tomorrow. Wear the red dress. Brock Steele, the aggressive golden boy rival from Vanguard Equity, a man known as much for his predatory corporate takeovers as his tailored Tom Ford suits. Raphael didn't gasp. He didn't throw his heavy crystal glass against the wall or storm into the bedroom to demand answers and tears. The pain that hit him wasn't sharp. It was a heavy, sinking anchor dragging his lungs into his stomach. It was the profound, hollow realization that the woman sleeping just 20 feet away in their bed had been gone for a long, long time. He looked at his own hands, steady calloused from his weekend woodworking, completely foreign to the ruthless, manicured world Sophia and Brock inhabited. He was an architect, a builder of foundations, while his wife spent her days betting on volatile futures. Clearly, she had hedged her bets on their marriage too. Raphael picked up his own phone, navigating to a contact he rarely used outside of emergencies. He typed a single line to Tim Nelson, his oldest friend and a notoriously cynical divorce attorney. I need to see you tomorrow. Breakfast. Don't tell Sarah. He set the phone down and looked back toward the dark bedroom. There was no rage, only a chilling, absolute clarity settling over the penthouse like winter frost. He wasn't going to fight Brock Steele for his wife's affection. He wasn't going to beg, scream, or demand counseling. If Sophia wanted the thrill of the game, she could have it. Raphael was going to do the one thing she would never expect. He was going to forfeit, and in doing so, he would let her win a prize that would ultimately leave her with nothing. The hiss of the espresso machine was the only sound breaking the morning tension in the penthouse kitchen. Raphael stood by the marble counter, his eyes fixed on the dark, bitter liquid pooling into the porcelain cup. He hadn't slept. The hours between the blue glow of the phone and the gray light of dawn had been spent constructing a vault in his mind, locking away 10 years of memories, inside jokes, and whispered promises. Footsteps clicked sharply against the hardwood hall. Sophia appeared, a blur of motion and practiced efficiency. She was adjusting the clasp of her Cartier watch, her gaze already fixed on the emails scrolling across her tablet. And she was wearing the red dress. It was a stunning piece, structured, authoritative, yet undeniably alluring. It was exactly the kind of armor a partner at Sinclair Ventures wore to a high-stakes board meeting, and exactly what Brock Steele had ordered. A physical ache bloomed in Raphael's chest, a dull pressure against his ribs, but his face remained a mask of practiced calm. He slid the espresso cup across the island. "Morning," he said, his voice terrifyingly even. Sophia barely looked up, reaching blindly for the cup. "Morning. God, the pre-read for the Vanguard merger is a nightmare. I might be late tonight, Raph. Don't wait up for dinner." "Vanguard," Raphael repeated smoothly. The word tasted like ash. "Brock Steele's firm." "Yes." Sophia sighed, finally glancing at him, a flicker of something unreadable behind her dark eyes before she quickly masked it with corporate weariness. "He's ruthless. I need to be on my A game today to make sure Sinclair doesn't get steamrolled in the valuation." She drank the espresso in 2 quick gulps, completely oblivious to the man watching her. She leaned in, leaving a fleeting kiss on his cheek, a gesture so hollow it felt like a draft of cold air. "Love you. Have a good day at the studio." "Good luck with Brock," Raphael replied softly to the closing door. 2 hours later, the smell of burnt coffee and fried bacon replaced the sanitized, expensive air of Tribeca. Raphael sat in a vinyl booth at a midtown diner, watching Tim Nelson slide into the opposite seat. Tim, an aggressive family law attorney who viewed marriages as mere contractual liabilities, looked at Raphael with narrowed eyes. "You look like you're attending a funeral," Tim noted, tossing a thick manila folder onto the sticky Formica table. "I am," Raphael said quietly. He laid it out without theatrics. The late-night messages, the hotel elevator, the red dress. Tim didn't gasp or offer pity. His mind instantly went to work calculating assets, prenuptial clauses, and leverage. "Okay." Tim leaned forward, his voice a low conspiratorial hum. "We freeze the joint accounts. I can get a private investigator to document the affair. We use the moral turpitude clause to leverage her equity in the penthouse. She wants to play in the mud with the Vanguard sharks. We bleed her dry, in discovery." Raphael looked at the grease stains on the table, then up at his oldest friend. "No." Tim blinked. "No, Raph, she's sleeping with a rival partner. You have the smoking gun." "I don't want a war, Tim. Wars take years. Wars require me to care." Raphael leaned back, the chilling clarity from the night before solidifying into concrete resolve. "Draw up the papers. Give her the penthouse. Give her the liquid assets. I don't want a single dime of her Sinclair money." Tim stared at him as if he had lost his mind. "You're just going to let her walk away with everything. Let her win." "She thinks she's trading up," Raphael murmured, gazing out the diner window at the indifferent rush of the city. "Let her have the illusion. I don't just want a divorce, Tim. I want you to help me disappear. Completely." The ultimate punishment wasn't taking away her money or destroying her reputation. It was removing himself so entirely from her world that when her new reality inevitably crumbled under Brock's weight, there would be absolutely nothing left for her to fall back on. The Baccarat Hotel Lounge was a sanctuary of crimson velvet and refracted light, a place where Manhattan's elite came to negotiate both mergers and infidelities in hushed tones. Sophia took a sip of her champagne, the bubbles sharp and cold against her tongue. Across the small mirrored table, Brock Steele swirled his bourbon. He looked at her with the calculating hunger of a man who had just closed a multi-million-dollar acquisition, though in this moment the asset he was admiring was her. "You gutted them in that room today, Sophie," Brock murmured, leaning closer so the scent of his expensive cologne sandalwood and ambition washed over her. Under the table, his hand rested heavily on her thigh, a possessive weight she leaned into rather than pulled away from. "Sinclair doesn't know what they have. You're carrying the entire firm on your shoulders." "It was just a valuation adjustment," Sophia replied, though a flush of pride warmed her neck. This was what she craved: the synergy, the mutual understanding of power. Raphael was a good man, she often told herself, to soothe the dull ache of guilt, but he was an architect of quiet spaces. He didn't understand the blood sport of venture capital. He didn't understand her. Brock's thumb drew a slow, deliberate circle on her skin through the silk of her red dress. "You're a predator, Sophia. You belong in the deep water. Stop pretending you're satisfied waiting in the shallows." She closed her eyes, letting the intoxicating illusion wash over her. She wasn't destroying a marriage. She was simply outgrowing it. It was a brutal but necessary evolution. Across the East River in a loft space in Dumbo overlooking the Brooklyn Bridge, there was no champagne. There was only the scent of cedar wood, drafting paper, and the biting chill of finality. Raphael stood over his massive oak drafting table, pulling down the architectural blueprints of his life. He wasn't throwing things into boxes with the chaotic energy of a heartbroken man. He was operating with the clinical precision of a surgeon amputating a limb. He carefully rolled up his original sketches, sliding them into a leather tube. He left the expensive, state-of-the-art rendering computers untouched. They were bought with the joint account funded largely by Sophia's Sinclair bonuses. He didn't want them. He wanted absolutely nothing that bore the fingerprints of their decade together. His laptop glowed in the dim, dusty light of the studio. With a few deliberate keystrokes, he authorized the transfer of his modest premarital savings into a newly established private trust. He then composed a brief, sterile email to his landlord, breaking the lease on the studio effective at the end of the month. The penalty fee was exorbitant, but freedom always came with a tax. He picked up a framed photograph from his desk. It was from a trip to the Amalfi Coast 5 years ago. Sophia was laughing, the Mediterranean sun catching the gold in her eyes, leaning into his chest as if he were her anchor. Raphael stared at the glass for a long moment, listening to the muffled roar of the subway trains rattling over the Manhattan Bridge outside. He didn't break the frame. He didn't tear the photograph. He simply placed it face down inside the nearest trash can, letting a stack of discarded invoices fall over it like dirt on a grave. Raphael turned off the studio lights, plunging the room into darkness. The escape was nearly complete. The elevator doors opened directly into the penthouse, admitting a tired Sophia along with the faint metallic scent of ozone and city rain. She kicked off her Louboutins, letting them drop onto the woven entryway runner with a dull thud. Her mind was still racing with term sheets and the lingering heated memory of Brock's hands in the back of a town car an hour ago. She mentally rehearsed her script: a late dinner with the European investors, a migraine, a need to sleep in the guest room. But Raphael was not in his study, nor was he in the kitchen. He was sitting on the edge of the low-profile Italian sofa in the living room, illuminated only by the floor lamps that cast long, stark shadows across the hardwood. On the glass coffee table in front of him rested a thick manila envelope. "You're home early," Sophia said, her voice catching slightly. The silence in the room wasn't the usual comfortable quiet of their marriage. It was dense, the almost physical. Raphael stood up. He wore a simple gray sweater and dark jeans, looking calm, rested, and entirely disconnected from the space around him. He did not ask about her day. He did not ask about the European investors. "I had Tim draft these today." Raphael said, his tone conversational, as if pointing out a misdelivered piece of mail. He gestured to the envelope. "I've already signed my portions." Sophia's eyes darted from his face to the table. She took a slow, hesitant step forward. "Draft what?" "The divorce settlement." The words dropped into the room, heavy and absolute. Sophia felt the air evacuate from her lungs. Panic, guilt, and an instinctual defensiveness flared in her chest. She braced herself for the shouting, for the accusations, for the inevitable moment he would throw Brock's name in her face. She tightened her grip on her leather briefcase, ready for the war. "Raphael, what are you talking about?" she managed, trying to inject the right amount of shock into her voice. "Where is this coming from?" "You get the penthouse," Raphael continued, entirely ignoring her question. His voice was smooth, devoid of any jagged edges of betrayal. "You keep the joint investment accounts and all your equity at Sinclair. I've waived spousal support. The only thing I am taking is my personal checking account and the vintage Porsche. The title transfer is already in there." Sophia stared at him, bewildered. This wasn't how this was supposed to happen. There was supposed to be a reckoning. You're just leaving. You're giving me everything. Raphael looked at her. For a fraction of a second, Sophia searched his dark eyes for the man who used to trace the lines of her palm and talk about building a cabin in upstate New York. He wasn't there. The man looking back at her was a stranger evaluating a vacant property. "Because you already took what you wanted at Sophia," he said quietly. There was no venom, no theatrical heartbreak, just a factual statement of a closed account. "I'm just doing the paperwork." He didn't wait for her to formulate a lie or an apology. He walked past her, his shoulder lightly brushing hers, and headed toward the hallway where a single canvas duffel bag was already waiting. Standing alone in the vast, perfectly curated living room, Sophia looked down at the manila envelope. Her hands trembled slightly as she touched the coarse paper. She had expected to fight tooth and nail for her freedom, to drag herself through months of bitter legal battles to secure her new life with Brock. Instead, Raphael had handed her the keys to her cage and simply walked out. It was exactly what she wanted. It was a total, uncontested victory. So why did the penthouse suddenly feel so unbearably cold? 2 weeks after the manila envelope, the Tribeca penthouse felt entirely different. It was louder now, filled with the booming baritone of Brock Steele taking early morning conference calls while pacing across the Persian rugs. Sophia told herself this was the vibrant, high-frequency life she had always been destined for. Then the smart home server crashed. It was a Tuesday evening. Brock was at a charity gala for Vanguard Equity, an event she had opted out of, citing a migraine. The penthouse suddenly plunged into a stubborn, analog darkness, the climate control dying along with the recessed lighting. Raphael, with his meticulous architectural background, had custom-built the network. He was the only one who knew the master override codes. Sitting on the edge of the oversized Italian sofa, illuminated only by the ambient streetlights filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Sophia picked up her phone. It was an involuntary muscle memory. She opened her messages, bypassing Brock's pinned thread, and typed a quick, pragmatic text to Raphael. "Hey, the central server is down. Do you remember the admin password? Hope you are doing well." She pressed send. Almost instantly, the text turned green. Then a harsh red exclamation point appeared. Message not delivered. Sophia frowned. She tapped the phone icon, putting it to her ear. She expected the familiar, calm cadence of his voicemail greeting, ready to leave a polite message. Instead, a harsh three-tone chime pierced the quiet room, followed by a sterile automated voice. "We're sorry. The number you have reached has been disconnected or is no longer in service." A cold, prickling sensation began at the base of her neck. She opened her email app, drafting a quick message to his studio's domain. She hit send. 5 seconds later, a postmaster notification bounced back to the top of her inbox. Address not found. Domain unassigned. Panic, irrational and sharp, flared in her chest. She opened LinkedIn, typing his name into the search bar. Nothing. She checked Instagram, a platform he barely used anyway. User not found. It was as if a digital architect had gone through the internet and systematically dismantled the existence of Rafael Vasquez, leaving not a single byte of data behind. Desperate, she scrolled through her contacts and pressed call on Tim Nelson's number. It rang once before connecting. "Tim?" Sophia started, her voice sounding thin and reedy in the dark apartment. "I'm trying to reach Raf. His phone is disconnected. Do you have his new number?" There was a heavy pause on the other end of the line. The clinking of ice against a glass, then Tim's voice devoid of any professional courtesy. "Raphael doesn't have a new number for you, Sophia. I just need the house server password. It's not a big deal." "Where is he?" "He's gone," Tim said, his tone flat final. "The paperwork is filed. The ink is dry. He's left the state, and he instructed me not to forward any correspondence, personal or otherwise. You have your penthouse. Sophia, hire an IT guy." The line went dead. Sophia lowered the phone slowly, the screen casting a pale light over her face. The city outside continued its relentless, glittering hum, but inside the glass walls of her $50 million cage, the silence was deafening. Raphael hadn't just left her, he had erased her. He had turned himself into a ghost, and the absolute suffocating weight of his absence was suddenly heavier than any screaming match could have ever been. She sat alone in the dark, pulling her cashmere wrap tighter around her shoulders, shivering in the unheated room. The flash bulbs at the entrance of the Pierre Hotel ballroom erupted in a blinding staccato rhythm, fracturing the night into stark white snapshots. Sofia Rodriguez and Brock Steele were making their official debut. They were a vision of corporate royalty. Brock in a bespoke midnight blue tuxedo, Sofia in an emerald silk gown that clung to her frame like liquid glass. Whispers rippled through the crowd of venture capitalists, hedge fund managers, and media executives. The scandal of her rapid divorce had barely cooled, making their appearance the most coveted spectacle of the evening. Sophia lifted her chin, offering a practiced, brilliant smile to the cameras. This was the pinnacle. This was the unapologetic, high-velocity life she had craved. Yet as they navigated the crowded ballroom, the heavy warmth of Brock's hand rested flat against the bare skin of her lower back. It was a familiar touch, but tonight the pressure was different. It didn't feel like a gesture of affection. It felt like a rudder physically steering her away from the colleagues she wanted to greet and toward the Vanguard Equity board members he wanted to impress. "Brock, look, there's Marcus from Sinclair," Sophia murmured, leaning slightly toward him to be heard over the swell of the live jazz band. "I need to talk to him about the biotech portfolio." Brock's fingers tightened incrementally against her spine, a silent, immovable barrier. "Let Marcus handle his own portfolio tonight, Sophie. We're heading over to the table with the offshore developers. You need to charm their lead counsel for me." Before she could protest, he was already guiding her forward, his charisma acting as a plow through the crowd. Later, standing near the towering champagne pyramid, Sophia reached for a crystal flute. A waiter's tray was halfway to her hand when Brock casually intercepted it, swapping to the champagne for a gin martini. "She'll take this," Brock told the waiter smoothly, handing the chilled glass to Sophia. He smiled down at her, his teeth gleaming perfectly in the chandelier light. "Champagne makes you sluggish, babe. You need to stay sharp for the after-party." Sophia stared at the clear liquid, the olive resting like a dead eye at the bottom of the glass. She hated gin. "I prefer champagne, Brock," she said, keeping her voice light, attempting to mask the sudden sharp spike of irritation. "Not tonight, you don't," he replied easily, tapping the rim of her glass with his own before turning to greet a passing senator. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a directive. Sophia took a small burning sip of the gin, her throat tightening. She looked around the opulent room filled with people who viewed her as a conqueror, a woman who had ruthlessly upgraded her life. But as Brock draped his arm heavily over her shoulders, pulling her flush against his side while he talked over her to a group of investors, a suffocating realization began to take root. Raphael had never paraded her. He had never used her as a shiny corporate asset to leverage a conversation. In the quiet, expansive rooms he built, he had simply let her be. She took another sip of the bitter drink, her gaze drifting toward the heavy oak doors of the ballroom. She was standing in the exact center of the world she had always wanted, wrapped in the arms of the man she had sacrificed everything for. So why did she suddenly feel like she was suffocating? The glass walls of Vanguard Equity were tinted a fraction too dark, making the midday Manhattan sun look like a perpetual looming storm. Sitting across from Brock at his expansive obsidian desk, Sophia stared at the confidential term sheet resting near her fingertips. It was the Helios Biotech acquisition, a crown jewel Sinclair Ventures had been quietly nurturing for 8 months. Sophia had spearheaded it. It was her ticket to senior partner. Brock leaned back in his leather chair, tossing a silver pen casually between his fingers. He didn't look at the document. He looked at her. 48 hours, Sophie," he said, his voice a low, soothing baritone that entirely masked the audacity of his request. "That's all I need. Just stall the final partner vote at Sinclair until Friday." Sophia's jaw tightened. The air in the office felt overly air-conditioned, raising goosebumps on her arms. "I can't do that, Brock. The board is ready to sign tomorrow. If I pull back now, they'll demand a reason. I'd have to manufacture a flaw in the due diligence." "So manufacture one," Brock replied seamlessly. He stood walking around the desk to stand behind her chair. His hands fell onto her bare shoulders, heavy and warm. "Tell them the FDA compliance review needs a second pass. Tell them the patent portfolio looks shaky. You're their star. They'll believe you." "It's a breach of fiduciary duty," she whispered, staring at the Sinclair logo printed on the thick paper. "If Marcus finds out I stalled so Vanguard could submit a hostile counteroffer, I'll be blacklisted." "My career," Brock's fingers began to knead the tense muscles at the base of her neck. It wasn't a massage. It was a physical reminder of his presence, his leverage. "You're thinking like a mid-level employee, Sophia. I thought we were building an empire together. Vanguard is about to launch a new healthcare fund. If we land Helios, the payout is astronomical. We win." "We," the word tasted metallic and sour in her mouth. When she left Raphael, she had convinced herself She was moving toward an equal partnership, a meeting of two apex predators. But sitting in this freezing office, feeling the weight of Brock's hands physically pressing her down into the chair, the reality crystallized with sickening clarity. Brock didn't see her as a partner. He saw her as an inside agent, a master key to Sinclair's vaults. Raphael had never once asked her to compromise her integrity. When she used to bring home the agonizing stress of a looming deal, he would pour her a glass of wine, listen for hours without interrupting, and tell her she was the most brilliant person in the room. He protected her ambition. Brock, she realized with a wave of cold dread, was systematically weaponizing it to serve himself. "Sophie," Brock murmured, leaning down so his lips brushed her ear. The scent of sandalwood, once intoxicating, now felt like a suffocating cloud. "Are you with me, or are you just going to be Sinclair's loyal workhorse forever?" It was a trap. If she refused, the brittle illusion of their perfect dynamic would shatter, exposing the colossal mistake she had made. She had burned her marriage to the ground for this man. She had alienated her friends. If she lost Brock's approval, she had nothing left to justify the wreckage. Slowly, her hand moved across the polished desk. Her fingers closed around the edge of the Helios file. She pulled it toward her, the thick paper scraping harshly against the obsidian glass. "I'll tell Marcus the patent review is incomplete," she said, her voice entirely devoid of emotion. "Good girl." Brock smiled, kissing the top of her head before walking back to his chair. Sophia kept her eyes fixed on the file, unable to look at him. She had just traded a piece of her professional soul, and in the deafening silence of her own mind, she had never felt more utterly alone. The rain over the Brooklyn Bridge was relentless. The windshield wipers of Sophia's Mercedes SUV smearing the gray city into a distorted watercolor. She hadn't slept properly since the Helios deal. The guilt of sabotaging her own firm had settled into her bones like a deep, persistent ache, one that Brock's lavish gifts and empty praises could not soothe. Brock was in the Hamptons for the weekend, networking on a golf course, leaving her alone in the cavernous silence of the penthouse. She told herself the drive to Dumbo was purely administrative. She needed the 2023 joint tax addendums for her new individual wealth management portfolio. Tim Nelson's office had ignored her emails, and Raphael's digital footprint remained non-existent. The only logical step was to physically go to his studio. It was a practical, necessary errand. At least that was the lie she repeated until she parked on the cobblestone street beneath the Manhattan Bridge. The air outside tasted of wet brick and salt. Sophia pulled her trench coat tightly around her, her heels clicking a familiar echoing rhythm on the pavement as she approached the heavy industrial doors of the converted warehouse. For years, this building had been her sanctuary. Whenever the vicious currents of venture capital threatened to pull her under, she would come here. Raphael would be sketching under the warm amber glow of his desk lamp, smelling of cedarwood and espresso. He would simply look up, smile, and the chaos of her world would instantly neutralize. She reached the third floor, her heart beating a fast, unnatural rhythm against her ribs. She turned the corner, walking towards Suite 304. She stopped abruptly. The discreet, brushed brass plaque that used to read Vasquez Architecture was gone. In its place hung a glaring neon pink acrylic sign, Neon Pulse Digital Media. Sophia stared at it, a cold numbness spreading from her chest to her fingertips. She pushed the heavy door open. The scent of cedar was entirely eradicated, replaced by the sterile smell of new carpet and ozone from a dozen oversized monitors. The expansive oak drafting tables were missing. The space had been broken up by frosted glass partitions. It was loud, chaotic, and entirely foreign. A young man in a graphic tee looked up from a reception desk. "Hey, can I help you? We're technically closed for the weekend, just doing some server maintenance." Sophia's voice faltered. She suddenly felt ridiculous in her designer trench coat, standing in the middle of a stranger's office. "I'm looking for Rafael Vasquez, the architect who used to lease this space." The young man frowned, clicking his mouse. "Vasquez, nah, we took over this lease 3 months ago. The management company completely gutted the place before we moved in. Didn't leave a single paperclip." 3 months ago. He had broken the lease the very week he handed her the divorce papers. He had orchestrated his vanishing act perfectly. "Did he leave a forwarding address?" Sophia asked, her voice barely a whisper. "With the building manager?" "I don't think so, lady. The super said the guy paid the penalty in cash and just vanished. Clean break, you know." "Clean break." Thank you, Sophia managed to say, turning blindly toward the exit. She didn't remember the walk down the stairs or the walk back to her car. She only registered the moment she was sitting behind the leather-wrapped steering wheel, the rain drumming violently against the reinforced glass. She gripped the wheel, her knuckles turning white. She had won. She had the penthouse, the Sinclair equity, and the Golden Boy partner. She was a master of the universe. Yet sitting in the damp chill of her luxury car, staring at a building that no longer held any trace of the man who had loved her, Sophia realized the devastating truth of Raphael's surrender. He hadn't fought her because he knew he didn't have to. He had simply stepped out of her orbit, letting her float away into the dark, freezing vacuum of her own ambition. And now she was completely terrifyingly alone. A single broken sob tore through her throat, drowning out the sound of the Brooklyn rain. The mahogany table in the Sinclair Ventures boardroom was usually a place of triumph for Sophia. Today it felt like a slab. The morning sun glared through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long, sharp shadows across the scattered financial dossiers. At the head of the table sat Marcus, the senior managing partner, his usually warm demeanor replaced by a rigid, terrifying stillness. Sophia took her seat, smoothing the skirt of her charcoal suit. She had done exactly what Brock asked. She had drafted the memo citing incomplete FDA compliance and shaky patent portfolios for the Helios Biotech acquisition, effectively freezing Sinclair's final offer. She had told herself she was simply buying time. Marcus didn't offer his usual morning pleasantries. He bypassed the projector, entirely sliding a single thick document down the center of the polished wood. It stopped precisely in front of Sophia. At 6 a.m. this morning, Marcus began, his voice dangerously quiet. Vanguard Equity submitted a hostile, aggressive bid directly to the Helios board, a bid that bypasses their standard valuation protocols. Sophia's blood ran cold. Her fingers hovered over the document. The Vanguard logo stared back at her like a predator's eye. That's impossible. Vanguard wasn't even in the data room. They didn't have the runway for a bid this size. They didn't need the data room, Marcus replied, leaning forward, resting his steepled fingers against his lips. Because their term sheet specifically leverages a sudden devaluation based on, and I quote, unresolved FD, compliance liabilities and patent vulnerabilities. The exact vulnerabilities you flagged in your internal memo to us yesterday afternoon, Sophia. The silence in the room was absolute. The other 6 partners at the table stared at her. Their eyes, previously filled with respect for their star, closer, were now veiled with suspicion, calculation, and a cold creeping realization. A ringing sound started low in Sophia's ears. The air in the room felt thick, oxygen-starved. She looked down at the Vanguard term sheet. Brock hadn't just asked her to stall. He had used her fabricated memo to justify a lowball predatory strike, knowing Helios would panic and accept. Worse, he had orchestrated it so the leak traced directly back to her desk. He hadn't built an empire with her. He had used her as a human shield. It's a remarkable coincidence, Marcus said softly, the polite phrasing slicing deeper than any accusation. That Vanguard would possess such intimate knowledge of our proprietary due diligence, especially considering your highly publicized personal transition, Sophia. Marcus, Sophia started, her voice faltering. She was a master negotiator, a woman who could talk a tech startup down from $1 billion valuation without blinking. But looking into the eyes of her mentor, she had absolutely nothing. If she denied it, she looked incompetent. If she confessed, she was guilty of corporate espionage and career suicide. Brock had meticulously backed her into a corner where every exit led to her destruction. Her phone vibrated silently in her blazer pocket. The screen lit up through the dark fabric. She didn't need to look at it to know it was Brock. It would be a text claiming victory, praising her for playing her part, completely oblivious or utterly indifferent to the fact that he had just publicly immolated her reputation. "We are launching an internal audit immediately," Marcus announced, standing up and buttoning his jacket. He didn't look at Sophia again. "Until the source of this leak is verified, Sophia, you are recused from the healthcare portfolio, and your access to the secure servers is suspended." The partners filed out of the room, the heavy glass door clicking shut behind them, sealing the silence. Sophia remained frozen in her leather chair. The vibrant, high-frequency life she thought she had secured dissolved into the sterile, unforgiving light of the boardroom. She had traded a man who built foundations for a man who specialized in hostile takeovers. And now she was finally realizing who the ultimate target had been all along. The Tribeca penthouse had never felt larger or colder. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the glittering Manhattan skyline, but tonight the city lights felt like thousands of mocking eyes. Sophia sat on the edge of the velvet sofa, a half-empty glass of scotch resting on the glass table. Next to it was a small cardboard box containing a framed degree, a few personalized silver pens, and her corporate security badge deactivated. The heavy oak door swung open and the silence shattered. Brock strode in, bringing the smell of expensive cigars and the sharp winter air with him. He was animated, practically vibrating with the adrenaline of a massive kill. "Sophie, you should have been at the Capitol Grill," he announced, tossing his cashmere overcoat onto a chair. He walked straight to the bar cart, pouring himself a generous measure of Macallan. The Helios board officially accepted the term sheet. The ink is dry and it's the biggest healthcare acquisition of the quarter. Sophia didn't move. She didn't look at him. She stared at the deactivated keycard in the cardboard box. "Marcus suspended me today, Brock, pending an internal audit." Brock paused, the crystal decanter hovering over his glass. He completed the pour, took a slow sip, and turned to face her. There was no shock on his face, no sympathy. "It's a temporary setback, a necessary casualty for a bigger victory. You knew the risks when we made the play." "A necessary casualty," Sophia repeated, her voice a hollow whisper. She finally looked up, her dark eyes locking onto his. "You used my own confidential memo to blindside my firm. You made it look like I leaked the due diligence directly to Vanguard. You didn't just win a deal, Brock. You immolated my entire career." Brock sighed, an exaggerated sound of profound patience, the kind one might use with a stubborn child. He walked over, standing over her. The possessive weight he usually carried now just felt oppressive. "Sophia, grow up. This is the major leagues. You wanted to swim with the Sharks, didn't you? You think Sinclair wouldn't have done the exact same thing to Vanguard if they had the inside track?" "I was your inside track," she said, the realization settling like lead in her stomach. "That's all this ever was. You didn't want a partner. You wanted a skeleton key to Sinclair's vault." "Don't be dramatic," Brock scoffed, taking another sip of his scotch. He turned away, entirely unbothered by her unraveling. "You'll weather the audit. Take a few months off. Go to St. Bart's. When the dust settles, I'll find you a VP spot at one of Vanguard's portfolio companies. You're taken care of." A VP spot at a portfolio company, a decorative role for a discarded asset. She had been on track to become a senior managing partner at one of the most prestigious VC firms in the country. Now she was just another piece of leverage Brock had successfully liquidated. She looked at him, at his tailored suit, his arrogant posture, his absolute lack of remorse. The illusion of their grand, unstoppable romance shattered completely, leaving behind a sterile transactional reality. She had burned down a home built on unconditional love for a penthouse built on shifting sand. Raphael had never asked her to shrink. He had never used her ambition as a weapon against her. In his quiet, steady way, he had been the only real power she ever possessed. And she had handed him a divorce settlement on a silver platter for a man who didn't even respect her enough to look her in the eye while he destroyed her. Brock checked his diamond-encrusted watch. "I have a celebratory dinner with the offshore developers at Per Se in 20 minutes. Put on the red dress, Sophie. Let's go take a victory lap." Sophia looked down at her hands, empty and trembling. "I'm not going." Brock stopped at the door. He looked back at her, his expression hardening into something cold and unrecognizable. "Suit yourself, but understand this. Sophia, you don't have Sinclair anymore. You have me. I'd suggest you learn how to be a team player." The door clicked shut. The silence rushed back in, absolute and suffocating. Sophia sat in her $50 million cage, entirely irreversibly trapped. The heavy Montblanc pen felt entirely alien in Sophia's hand. The scratch of the nib against the thick legal parchment was the only sound in Tim Nelson's Midtown office. The room was devoid of warmth, all glass steel and dark mahogany, a fitting environment for the dismantling of a life. Sophia signed her name on the final line, completing the absolute transfer of the Tribeca penthouse and the joint investment portfolios into her sole possession. She was wearing a muted gray cashmere turtleneck. Her face pale, the dark circles under her eyes stark against her skin. The predatory confidence she had worn like armor just weeks ago had completely evaporated. She pushed the dossier across the polished desk. Tim Nelson took it, his expression unreadable, and meticulously checked the signatures before slipping it into a thick leather binder. "That's it," Tim said, his voice clipped and professional. "The decoupling is legally finalized. The deed will be recorded by the end of the week. You have everything." Sophia kept her eyes on the empty space where the folder had been. "Tim," she started, her voice cracking slightly. She swallowed the pride she used to rely on, feeling like ashes in her throat. "Please, I just need to know if he's okay. I need to tell him." "Tell him what, Sophia?" Tim interrupted, leaning back in his chair. The lawyer's professional detachment finally fractured, revealing a cold, simmering contempt. "That you're sorry that you made a mistake, or that Brock Steele bled you dry and hung you out to dry at Sinclair just like everyone in this city knew he would." Sophia flinched as if she had been struck. She hadn't realized the news of her suspension had traveled so far. But of course it had. Blood in the water always drew an audience. "I didn't know," she whispered, staring blindly at her hands. "Raphael knew," Tim said quietly. The words fell into the room like stones. Sophia looked up, her breath catching. "What?" Tim unlocked his bottom drawer and pulled out a single sheet of paper. He didn't hand it to her, he just looked at it. "The morning he came to me to draft the divorce papers, it had a private investigator on standby. I had the strategy mapped out to freeze your Sinclair equity under a moral turpitude clause. We could have dragged you and Brock through a discovery process so ugly it would have gotten you both fired. I told Raphael we could take half of everything you built." Sophia felt a cold sweat break out along her spine. She knew Tim's reputation. He could have destroyed her. "Do you know why he refused?" Tim asked, his eyes locking onto hers with brutal intensity. "He told me her career is her spine. If we take Sinclair from her, she'll have nothing to stand on when Steele eventually drops her." "He didn't walk away because he was weak, Sophia. He walked away taking absolutely nothing to protect the very career you just let that parasite destroy." The silence in the office became a physical weight pressing down on Sophia's chest until she couldn't pull air into her lungs. "He knew you were walking into a trap," Tim continued, his voice devoid of pity. "But he also knew you were too blinded by your own ambition to listen to him. So he stepped out of the way. He gave you the penthouse so you wouldn't be displaced. He left the accounts intact so you'd have a safety net. He let you win, hoping that when the illusion finally broke, you'd at least survive the fall." Tim stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. He looked down at the brilliant, ruined woman sitting across from him. "He spent his last act as your husband, making sure you were safe from the man you replaced him with. And you threw it all away anyway." "There is no forwarding address, Sophia. There is nothing left to say." Sophia couldn't speak. She couldn't cry. The magnitude of Raphael's silent, agonizing grace collided with the cheap, transactional reality of her betrayal. She stood up on trembling legs, walking out of the glass office and into the sterile hallway. She had traded a man who loved her enough to orchestrate his own loss for her survival, for a man who used her as kindling to warm his own hands. The epiphany did not bring closure. It only brought the suffocating realization that she had authored her own total destruction. The private elevator opened with a soft, melodic chime, a sound that used to signal arrival and triumph. Now it merely announced her containment. Sophia stepped into the Tribeca penthouse, the heavy oak doors sealing shut behind her with a definitive click. Brock's things were already gone. Just 2 days after her suspension became permanent pending the Sinclair board's final vote, he had quietly dispatched a junior assistant to pack his bespoke suits and imported cigars. There had been no screaming match, no passionate closure. He had simply cut his losses, excising her from his portfolio as easily as liquidating a toxic asset. She walked slowly across the vast expanse of the living room, leaving her coat pooled on the floor where it fell. The heated hardwood felt strangely cold against her bare feet. The smart server, recently repaired by an anonymous, overpriced technician, hummed flawlessly, maintaining the air at a sterile 68 degrees. It was a perfect climate-controlled environment, holding absolutely nothing. Sophia moved to the kitchen island, the same marble counter where she used to leave her phone face down in the dark. She bypassed the crystal decanters of Macallan and reached into the very back of the lowest cabinet, pulling out a cheap half-empty bottle of bourbon. It was the brand Raphael used to drink years ago, long before she had convinced him to upgrade his tastes to match their tax bracket. She poured it into a water glass and took a swallow. It burned her throat raw and unrefined, leaving an acrid aftertaste that perfectly matched the hollow ache in her chest. Glass in hand, she walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows. Manhattan stretched out beneath her, a vast glittering grid of diamond lights and pulsing arteries. Millions of people, millions of ambitions, all moving to the relentless rhythm of the city. This was the summit she had ruthlessly clawed her way up to conquer. She had sacrificed her integrity, her prestigious career, and the only man who had ever looked at her without calculating her net worth, all to secure this exact vantage point. Tim Nelson's words echoed in the cavernous, empty room louder than the city traffic below. He let you win, hoping that when the illusion finally broke, you'd at least survive the fall. Raphael's revenge had never been about destruction. He was an architect. He built things, he didn't tear them down. His vengeance was a profound, devastating act of permission. He had recognized the poison of her ambition, unlatched the gate, stepped aside, and allowed her to walk willingly off the precipice. He hadn't orchestrated her ruin. He had simply stopped being the gravity that kept her grounded. Sophia pressed her free hand against the freezing glass, looking at her own faint reflection, superimposed over the city skyline. She was a woman draped in luxury, legally secure, financially independent, and utterly, irreparably bankrupt. She had won the war, claiming every prize she had demanded. She closed her eyes, the bourbon resting heavy in her stomach. She was the sole ruler of an empire of dust, and for the first time in her life, the great glittering city below offered her absolutely nothing but silence.